Taina, good to see you. Marco. Esther, I'm not sure we've met, but I look forward to meeting you. Met you now virtually. I'm going to start chatting a little. Andrew, good to see you. You got your, can you hear me? Oh, good. You're waving. I can see you can hear me. I can't hear you yet. Oh, there you go.
Hello. Yes, I couldn't unmute until a moment ago. So I thought I'll wave so you know I'm not ignoring you.
Well, I usually start chatting just a little bit before the formal session begins. In part, kind of get into relationship. I discovered about, I've lost track, 12 or 15 years ago, I'm really a teacher. I love teaching. The teaching that I've done has been actually at the college level, business, economics, entrepreneurship, and leadership. But I frankly always thought and still believe that the most important teaching one can do is in the earliest years, pre-K, 3K, kindergarten, first and second grade. And this very much fits into that. I'll tell a little story about how I became interested in this. I'm waiting till 6:30 plus a minute or so for people to join us.
Sure.
But I will say I did a little bit of my homework, Andrew. I really appreciate the material you sent. It turns out to be not a small subject. Learning
no, not at all.
Many facets. I did look at a bit of the assessment, the year two assessment. I found that really interesting.
Good.
And just highlights the multiple dimensions. I will say this, we're just coming up on the 30 minute. I spent most of my career in as a consultant, sometimes coaching training sessions in the mostly the corporate world, some in the government and not-for-profit arena. And that went fairly well. It wasn't until I started teaching that I felt that I really had to have myself operating at like multiple different levels at once. It was much more demanding, frankly, much more satisfying. Most of the students I taught, it's now 6:30, I'm warming up everybody. We'll get into the more formal launch in a moment or two. But most of the students I taught at CUNY School of Professional Studies, SUNY Stony Brook, also a local college called Malloy, were first generation students. And I just, I loved it. They were enthusiastic. They were committed. They kept me on my toes. I find the whole arena challenging, exhilarating, and really rewarding and satisfying. I'm going to comment now just a little bit on how I got interested in this particular facet of it. And that was, I grew up north of here in a little town called Briarcliff. And I moved away. My parents moved away. They actually split up and moved away, during my high school years. But at I went back for my 50th high school reunion and ran into one of the people I'd known since first grade. If you can picture kids coming out in their little white suits and little white dresses from first communion, that's actually the part of the picture that this brings to mind. And she with others had launched a program very much on this in the San Mateo, that's like Silicon Valley part of California. They called the Big Lift. And lots of people told her you couldn't get it done and you couldn't make it happen. Well, she and a partner and some others became involved over a number of years, got this program going, focused on the sort of the more challenging schools and the more challenging neighborhoods to be sure that every kid could read by third grade. And what I learned from her, and she'll never forget, is, and it's kind of a well-known philosophy saying and kind of truism in the educational arena, up to third grade, you learn to read. After third grade, up to third grade, you learn to read. After third grade, you read to learn. So if you haven't learned to read by third grade, you're going to be at a deficit, through the rest of your life. And that just gets, catches my attention, because if you can imagine, if you can't read in a reasonably facile way by third grade, think of there's almost nothing you can do in your educational career thereafter that they can catch you up and make up for that deficit. And I just I have an image of being that person, who couldn't quite get what was going on. And in another part of my life, I do some work in the criminal justice area. I mean, you can imagine people become disinterested in school, they drop out of school, they'll become truancy, and then maybe delinquency, and worse. And yes, it does end up in some cases into behavior on the other side of the law, and even ending up incarcerated. And the cost to them and their families, their loved ones, and of course also the larger community is just huge. So I don't think there could be a more important subject or conversation that we could have today than talking about this. Well, I do want to check. I know that our assembly person, Rebecca Seawright, was hoping to stop by at some point. I'm not sure she's made it yet, but when she does, I'd like to give her a few moments to make some comments about her views on the subject. I have one other point to make, which is this is also inspired by, and several of you on the community board are both familiar with and perhaps engaging with and getting on board with our social justice, social equity committee. And I see addressing this issue in our neighborhood, and frankly, in every neighborhood in the city, as being a burning priority. That phrase, leave no child behind, brings very, vividly kind of in my imagination and my sense of what's important. And so I would invite us over time. It's not something we have to decide tonight, but I would invite us over time to think about both in what fashions we can support this in our own community, but also in what ways we may be able to support Andrew in the work he does. Now, just to briefly introduce Andrew, and then I'll let you do the more detail yourself, Andrew. Andrew is the director of the Universal Literacy Initiative here in the city of New York. And you can correct any of my facts, but as best I recall our conversation, you're in something like year 4 at this point. You already have, and I'm a little poetic in this description perhaps, but you already have an army of, I think, 400 or more instructors out in the field. The piece that you gave me to look at in terms of assessment was at the end of year 2. You already we're covering almost 300 schools. You had almost something in the order of almost 240 instructors in your team. You were already reaching 70,000 students between years K, first grade, and second grade. So I'll leave it there, because anything more I say will reveal my ignorance, which I'm perfectly happy to do. And turn it over to Andrew. I do want to thank you so much, not just for being here tonight, but for what you do, every day of the year. As I think I've made clear to you, I don't think there's any initiative in the early school years that could be more important than this one. And I thank you so much for taking it on, leading it, and making it happen.
Thank you, Peter. I appreciate that. And
Before
thank you.
I'm so sorry, Andrew. Before
Sure.
we start, I just have to remind everyone that you all will remain muted throughout Andrew's presentation. And to participate, you go down to the bottom, and there's an icon that says participants, and you click that, and you'll press the raise your hand button. And then I will unmute you, and an unmute notification will pop up on your screen, which you'll have to click to confirm. But otherwise, everyone else will remain muted throughout until I mute you or you raise your hand.
Yes, and I want to thank you, Max, for being our support team. Not entirely behind the scenes. You're now visual part of the team, but yes. Thank God for you and Will and our entire Community Board 8 staff team to make all this work in this era of COVID.
Oh, thank you.
Any other comments we need to make at this point, Max, or can we turn it over to Andrew?
No, we can turn it over to Andrew.
It's all yours, Andrew.
Great.
In a way.
So thank you again. It's a pleasure to talk with you all tonight. And I hope it's really,
Andrew, I'm going to jump in. I do
Sure.
see Assembly Member Seabright. She's working under an alias tonight of an esteemed, actually a member of the Board of Trustees for SUNY. Assembly Member Seabright, would you care to make a few comments at this point before we launch into the deep end of the pool?
Thank you, Chairman Peter Patch. It's great to join you this evening, and I see my former intern Rami here as well. And I raised my kids through the public school system and public universities, and I sit on the education committee in the Assembly. And your forum tonight is something that is definitely needed and something that I support. And so I commend you all, and I'm looking forward to hearing your speaker this evening. So thank you for having me tonight, and happy holidays. Stay safe, everyone.
And thank you, Assembly Person Rebecca, for all you do to support us, the community as a whole, but particularly in the arena of education, which is, as you know, more than near and dear to my heart. Now, Andrew, for the third time, you're off.
Third time's the charm, right? So all good. So again, a pleasure to be with you all here this evening. And it'd be great if this was more of a conversation. I don't have slides. It's not going to be that kind of thing, but I can give some background as to where this work began 4+ years ago. And actually, not to call her out, but Esther Friedman, who is on this call, is actually the person who started this work. So hopefully Esther will
Thank you, Esther.
be open to sharing some as well. So this started back in really before 2016. And Esther, please, if I get the history wrong, feel free to jump in. But this was the or this was birthed by Chancellor Carmen Farina with Mayor de Blasio, and part of the Equity and Excellence for All agenda. And I think Chancellor Farina saw the basic need we're seeing now and wanted to address it, that we didn't have enough of our students reading at grade level before hitting 3rd grade and beyond. We knew from state test scores that we weren't meeting that mark. And so thought was given as to, well, what do we do? There could have been reading specialists placed in schools, and that's something that I think most people will, well, if you're of a certain age, you'll remember that schools had a reading specialist who worked directly with children. They provided intervention support. And for one reason or another here in the city, we saw less of that over time, which probably lent itself rather to the issues we were seeing with fewer students reading at grade level. So the thought, I think, centered around, do we go back to that? Do we figure something out around getting those specialists back in schools, or do we go a different route? And in the end, we went a different route with the placement of what we call reading coaches. You can think of them as literacy coaches. Reading is part of the name to differentiate these folks from a program that existed under Mayor Bloomberg and Chancellor Klein, where literacy coaches were placed in schools, not exactly in the same way. And the thought was that a reading coach who supported a school or a number of schools could build teacher capacity. And that capacity would be built in such a way that more and more students would be affected, as opposed to just a reading specialist. And I hate to say just a reading specialist, as if they're not important. They're vitally important. But a reading coach in working with teachers could affect more students over time than a reading specialist could. And so the idea was born, and we started out as really a pilot, and only in New York City do you have a pilot of over 100 specialists going into schools and over 100 schools. But that's what we did in districts 9 and 10 in the Bronx and 17 and 32 in Brooklyn. I have to really remember my history here. So there were 103 reading coaches and 107 schools. And the bulk of the coaches were assigned to single schools for support based on need. Schools that had lower third grade state ELA test proficiencies, where schools assigned a greater level of support. And then also enrollment was taken into account. So smaller schools were supported by a coach, meaning a coach could support 2 schools. Fast forward, over the course of the next year, we expanded 10 more districts. We started to work in Manhattan that year. And then year 3 of the initiative, we expanded throughout the rest of the city. We're now fast forward in year 5. And of course, the pandemic has made for a very unique year. And really that uniqueness, as we all know, began last March. So years 4 and 5 of the initiative are not going the way we had hoped. It felt like in year 4, before the pandemic, we had hit a stride. We were present throughout all 32 local community school districts, well above, close to 500 reading coaches across the city, working with teachers, kindergarten to 2nd grade. It didn't matter what kind of classroom, general education, special education, self-contained, ICT, transitional bilingual, dual language, depending on the coach and her or his background. All the while, again, trying to build capacity, doing some work with individual students, which I can talk more about as a way of making sure the coaches kept their professional learning happening themselves. Because, and you alluded to this, Peter, at the beginning, and I'm going to use the words of Dr. Louise DeMotes here, teaching reading is rocket science. It is quite difficult to do. And really, it's the crux of the initiative. We want to make sure that all 2nd graders finish that grade reading at grade level. They finish that year reading at grade level. Easy to say, hard to do, just like the teaching of reading itself. We didn't see an impact to our work in year 1. We didn't expect to, as with a pilot, we were figuring things out. Year 2, we did see impact, small, but something bright that gave us just hope that we would be able to do more and more. We were able to show statistically that students whose teachers received coaching scored higher on a growth measure that we use, the Gates-McGinnity reading tests, and students of teachers who were coached, those students did better the more coaching their teachers received. So sort of anecdotally, you could see, oh, all right, that makes sense, but we proved it with the numbers. Currently, year 3 results are being quality checked. It takes a long time for results to get out of the DOE, and the pandemic hasn't helped that. But we see equally bright spots in year 3. We'll see what we see for year 4. The problem is the pandemic caused, well, many hiccups, but a hiccup in our evaluation program. So we don't have end of the year assessment data like we would in a normal year. So our research and policy support group folks at the DOE are figuring out how can we report on our work. And whatever they figure out will continue into year 5, because of course, this year it'll be difficult to do any assessment of students in the way we did. And an additional problem or issue we're dealing with this year is that our coaches, while still a part of the initiative, are actually teaching. So they're mostly working in the schools they supported, but they have classes this year. And that's just because of the way New York City went back to school and how we have our students who are learning both in person and remotely, and then fully remote, and just more bodies on the ground were needed. And our coaches were asked to step up and accept that challenge. And of course they did. So I'm quite proud of the work they're doing. They're putting their professional learning to work. They're mostly working in kindergarten, first and second grade classrooms. And we hope as the pandemic gets under control that they will return to their coaching work next school year. So that's where we are in a nutshell. I could talk about all sorts of avenues. It'd be good, though, to stop for a moment, I think, to see if there are any questions so far, or see if there are particular topics within all that folks have questions about.
So this is open field day. If somebody wants to pose a question.
See, Billy has a hand.
I'm sorry?
I see Billy has his hand up.
Oh, please, go ahead. Unmute. There we go.
Andrew, thank you for joining us. This all sounds great, and I'd love to learn more. So one question I have is, if there were one or two things you'd recommend I could look up if I wanted to really dig in and learn more about this, what those would be. And then my other question, because I'm just afraid I missed it, you talked about reading specialists and reading coaches. Could you explain in a little more detail the differences between how they work and why it is I think, I'm gathering, we think reading coaches may be more effective? I think I missed some of it, and I wonder if there's more detail
Sure.
you can give us in those distinctions.
Sure. Do you mean learning more about the initiative itself in terms of your first question? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Sure. So I can either put some links into the chat, or Peter, I don't know if there's an easier way. It's really the links I sent you. Perhaps afterward they can be emailed around. Whatever is easiest we could.
If you put a couple links in the chat, as you have time to do that, you don't have to focus on that this minute. But yes,
Sure.
I can also forward that email to Max and the team at the community board office, and maybe we can include those links in our recap of the session, because they're really quite useful in terms of background and
Sure.
giving some overview.
And it's all public knowledge, perfectly fine to share, and we'll give you a nice idea of the work, where it's been and where we hope to go. In terms of the distinction, so it's funny, and again, I don't want to put Esther on the spot. If Esther's comfortable talking about reading specialists in the city, and the history behind that. But I think it's safe to say traditionally just elementary schools have had on staff a reading specialist, maybe going by a slightly different title, but this is a teacher who was specially trained in teaching children to read, and who would work as we think about an academic intervention services teacher does now in the city. So working with either small groups of children or perhaps one-on-one, depending on the school, depending on the workload. Providing additional support to make sure that child was learning to read. Simply said, maybe there is a language-based disability involved, maybe just more time required to make sure that that child was learning those necessary skills. In modern times, if you will, is a position that schools themselves would have to fund, just like any AIS teaching position. And not every school is able to fund that position, even though the state says you should have, well, you need to provide those services. And so someone should be providing those academic intervention services. I imagine in districts outside the city, it's a mixed bag again as to funding, whether they're able to have that particular position. Those specialists, and again, I think it would vary by district and school, sometimes worked with teachers as well, sometimes not. The reading coach position particularly works with teachers, primarily with teachers, with the idea is if I can help you to improve your instruction, your what we call tier 1 core instruction that you're delivering on a daily basis, you're going to get better over time. And your students will achieve at a higher level as that knowledge and skill base increases. And so instead of maybe working with, and I'm just going to throw a number out, 50 students over the course of maybe a semester, maybe the year, our reading coach is working with, depending on the size of the school, 5, 10, 15 teachers, 20, 25, 30 children in each of those classrooms. So doing that math, you're affecting more children over time. Don't quote me on the numbers, but just to give a general idea of reach. Esther, did I get
Great,
that
thank you.
history right in terms of, oh, I'm sorry. Can we unmute Esther if
Yeah,
she?
I did.
Yeah, oh,
You have to click to confirm.
Very much so.
and I
Yeah.
don't mean to put Esther on the spot, but Esther
No,
knows
that's
the
very
history.
helpful. Thank you both.
Sure, sure.
I'm
I
gonna
think
get-
if we could afford it,
Go ahead.
if I had a check I could write, I'd have both. I'd have the reading specialist and I'd have the reading coach, because I think both types of positions are needed, but that's expensive.
I was going to jump in and say, in terms of catching up with all the material you had, I began to remember what learning to read was like. And of course, Rami's always ahead of me on these subjects, because you were talking about phonics as soon as I raised the point. But you know, learning about phonics, then phoneme awareness, then vocabulary, then reading fluency, and reading comprehension. And when you say it's rocket science, I begin to realize, because none of those is trivial. And then the other piece of it always, and I'm sure you know, have ways of dealing with this, is the issue of different students learning at different rates, and how you deal with you know, trying to be sure that you you know, address the basic needs for everybody, but also try to keep the, you know, the some of the other students, you know, interested and involved and aware. But I defer to any other comments, or how about another question? Anyone else have
Rami has his hand up.
Rami has a comment. Please go ahead, Rami.
Yeah, so in response to that, Peter, Andrew, when you were developing your program, what kind of existing phonics-based reading programs did you look at? Did you invent just completely from scratch your own? And how do you think this can work? I'm sure the answer is yes, but do you think this can work on all of our schools in our DOE system?
So it's a very good question. And I think it'll help to start off just talking about city schools in general. So New York State and New York City are free adoption entities. They can use whatever they would like for curriculum within certain, well, not necessarily certain boundaries, but in general, they're free to choose. Some programs may be funded by the DOE, where the money for the program comes out of central, doesn't come out of a school budget, but in the end, a school gets to choose. So one of our challenges is we meet schools where they're at. We don't impose any kind of curricula or program on schools. It's a challenge because we have to then train our coaches in really just, or in a way we call agnostic, in a very agnostic way, so that they can walk in and deal with almost any program they find on the ground. Hopefully, it's a comprehensive, structured program that is heavy for kindergarten to second grade on work with or within phonological and phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency, and that it's rounded out by work in comprehension and vocabulary and writing, of course. That isn't always the case. So part of the coach's job is to see where schools are at, at rather, and offer recommendations to improve what they see, what they find, to fill gaps. Because even if there are good programs in place, there are always gaps. No program is perfect. And to Peter's point, there's no one program that works for every child. There is a way we know that children learn to read. So I don't want to make it sound like, because sometimes you'll hear that in the Twitterverse, children learn differently. There's still this obsession almost with learning styles, and that's been debunked by the cognitive scientists. But that doesn't mean that we're not fighting against things in that vein. We strongly believe in rigorous foundational skill instruction and push at every opportunity for a school to have an appropriate program that can be used in that vein. And I think we've made good progress in year 5. We have more and more schools using, for example, Wilson Language Training's Foundations program. And part of that has just been making sure that funding has gone to schools to purchase those programs. So if it was up to us, every school would have a rigorous program for foundational skill work like that. And we're hopefully, and we are hoping rather, we seem to be moving rather toward where there'll be not a mandate, but more control or more say in what am I trying to say? It's been a long day, I'm sorry. A smaller menu of possibilities in terms of that for schools and for assessment too. Because if we can corral that, then we can train our teachers, our coaches, we can provide professional learning directly on those programs. And that would go a long way instead of hit or miss trying to make sure that folks know what they're doing in terms of our coaches when they hit the ground, but teachers in buildings too. If that all made sense, hopefully it did.
Questions, comments? Oh, let me ask this. You mentioned, I mean, you're rolling out what is already a large program, and you've got a yet larger universe, I think, in terms of, you know, schools and the degree and ways in which you'd like to reach them. I think you started initially trying to target some of the, you know, more challenged schools in the more challenged neighborhoods. Can you talk a little bit about how that evolved? And I mean, unfortunately, I went to business school, and I shouldn't say it lightly or facetiously, but certainly one of the things I think about is how you measure performance. And obviously, in what we're talking about, reading at grade level, at whatever, first grade, second grade, third grade, is obviously a critical part of that. And I'd be interested a little bit in talking about where we are on that. And I'm going to make one color comment, which is, we already appreciate from what you've already said, and even talking about it a little bit, how challenging and large and critical and essential this whole program initiative is, and the whole learning to read element is. Having said that, we would like to be, you know, to have no child left behind. Like, we want 100% of the kids, if not more, reading at grade level. And that's an ideal world that if we could get there in 5 or 10 years, I think we'd be doing brilliantly. Or even if we could do it for, I don't know what the right numbers are, you know, 80%, 72%, what have you. But a little bit about sort of how you measure it and sort of where we stand on those kinds of measures.
Well, we're supposed to be at 100% by 2026. That was the original goal of the initiative. And 2/3 by next year. I don't know if we would have been at 2/3. We were headed there. I'm sorry, Peter.
I was going to jump in and say, if you get anywhere close, I'm going to call you Superman, but, you know, go ahead.
We were headed there. That's why, I mean, the pandemic is problematic for goodness knows how many reasons. I personally really felt that our work, we were on such a stride. I mean, I get so upset when I think about it, as we were completing year 4, heading into year 5. the pandemic took care of that. But to go back to your question, otherwise I'll just dwell in my misery. We picked those 4 districts because simply they had the greatest need. Low 3rd grade state test proficiency percentages. I think historically to some degree, and at the same time, in terms of evaluation, I think we knew it would take time to show any kind of impact there, just because of the nature of the need and that this work doesn't happen overnight. This improvement that we're trying to enact doesn't happen overnight. And then adding districts as we went, that there was still a need. I mean, we're still, spring 2019, 53.3% of 3rd graders reading on grade level. Still absolutely nothing to write home about, although an increase each year in recent history. But the focus was definitely on where that greatest need was first, as I think digging in and just being able to provide the greatest level of support from the get-go.
That all makes sense. And instantly, that 53% number, I thought I remembered that from somewhere. Is that for particular schools, or is that system-wide at 3rd grade?
No, that's system-wide for 3rd grade.
Got it.
So that's spring 2019. Of course, there's no, and that's the latest figure we have because testing rather didn't take place last year. And we'll see. I have personal doubt that they'll be testing this spring. And it's probably, it's.
Can I jump in again and make a quick
Sure.
point on it? And just so you know how I hear that number, I mean, obviously, you want to be absolutely as close to 100% as possible, because anywhere where we're not at 100%, we have a child who's at risk. And so that's understood. And we know that's where you're coming from. We know that's where you and the whole team that you're working with and all the teachers you're interacting with are coming from. But I hear that also as sort of a measure of the urgency and importance of what you're doing. And I don't take it as a negative. I take it as, if you know where you really are, then you know how large the mountain is you have to climb. And at some point, you and Esther might talk a little bit about sort of, and I don't even know how you speak about this, so it might be the wrong even way to frame the question, sort of what the challenges are in each of these sort of levels of what you're trying to communicate across to the teacher, and how the teacher responds to the coaching. And I noticed in some of the assessment, not every teacher responds absolutely enthusiastically and getting on board as soon as any kind of professional walks in. That has to be true of your coaches as well. So, I mean, you're moving something much larger than, what's the bad analogy? I mean, the Queen Mary is a teacup by comparison to what you're trying to move. And I just want you to know how much I both support and empathize with the size of the challenge you're talking about.
I see Rami also has his hand up again, very quickly.
Rami?
Yeah, so adding on to Peter again, I feel like this is a very common occurrence. But is a reading program like you have created possible to have another? So my question is, can this be something that we can start in our community board district? And is this something that you can teach the volunteers? How easy is it to learn the program that you have created? And another question adding on is, what kind of money does this look like? Like, how much money on a school basis? So one, as you said, one reading, two extra people in a school building. What does that cost?
So it's a good question for sure. Let me deal with the first part first. So it's not a program per se that we can provide to a teacher. So a school decides either a single curriculum or maybe a few programs. Sometimes schools think the more the better. That's usually not the case. But we work with the school and whatever curricula it's using. And so it's not something we can put, if this makes sense, into place in a school. We'll work with the school wherever it's at with whatever curricula it's using, however it's assessing students, and go from there in terms of working with teachers to enhance the instruction already happening. So it's replicable in that our coaches receive an immense amount of professional learning. Pre-COVID, we, for new coaches, did 3-week summer institutes, 15 days, 75 hours. As a DOE employee, I never experienced as much professional learning as we provided. Coaches in their first year received an additional 20 plus days out of the classroom. In subsequent years, 10 plus days. Because as we used to talk about, not everyone comes in fully baked. Teaching is complex. There's a lot to learn. You have to continually learn. And while we look for folks when we're hiring who've got kindergarten to second grade classroom experience, most of them haven't coached before because it's just not something that was available as a position in the district. So if we only brought on folks who coached, we would not have 400 plus individuals now. So it's a constant effort to enhance what our folks know and can do in their work with teachers. They are what we call teachers assigned. So they're UFT employees. They belong to the union, still on a teacher line, receiving that level of salary and benefits depending on their years of service and level of education. And that equates to not an inexpensive figure. So depending on that experience between salary and benefits, you could be easily talking $100,000, $150,000, just to throw some ballpark numbers out there. And so you could see just the expense of the initiative by having a coach, not at every elementary school, but 400 plus coaches across the system is not a small expense. So
Thank you so much.
replicable to a degree, but expensive as well.
Yeah.
Did that answer your?
Yes, 100%. That definitely
Okay.
answered my question. So a follow-up to that, in our CB8 has what, 12 schools in our district? I don't know the number off the top of my head, but what is a way that not costing $150,000 that we can help kids in our community improve rating skills?
So we've got coaches in CB8. We don't have a lot in our District 2, which is where CB8 lies. And that's just a factor of District 2 doing better in this regard than other districts in the city. I think it's a question of looking at local schools, what programs they are using, how teachers are teaching reading, and looking not just at in general how it's going, but how groups of students are doing. Students of color, students receiving special education service, students who are multilingual learners. Because what we find sometimes is that while a school might be doing better overall, those subgroups are not, but not necessarily getting the attention or attention that will cause their outcomes to increase. And maybe it's that they are in need of a different program that their teacher should use with them, or teacher training for a program they have, or in connection with a different program. And then, of course, how families can be partners in that work. Families, of course, are helping to enhance literacy development at home, simply by talking with kids. So what else can families do in that vein? Because we can't do the job alone. We couldn't do it before the pandemic. We certainly can't do it now. The DOE itself can't do it. There's so many agencies, organizations, et cetera, involved in this work. And I can talk more about that maybe towards the end, just something we're thinking about for this summer in that vein.
Thank you so much.
Sure. And no, unfortunately, easy answers. None of these answers are easy.
And that's why
no
this
quick solutions.
topic is fascinating too. And it's part of why Peter and I were discussing this before the meeting, was that how intertwined and complex this issue is. And like, it's not, as you said, it's not just in one school district. It's across the board. And you're seeing school students in schools across everywhere around the world that are having the COVID slide, the summer slide, just on a 9-month scale. And we discussed this in previous meetings, but it's also that being proactive about it, making sure we're not playing catch up. And as Peter said at the top of the meeting, so we're not playing catch up with students that fell behind in 3rd and 4th grade and can't catch up. And so once I think that your program especially is an amazing investment opportunity for our government and our community as a whole, because that your program can solve so many problems down the road that then we don't have to put millions and millions of dollars into, and they'll become you won't need them anymore because all of those problems will be solved. And I really do applaud the work you're doing with this.
Thank you. Yes, the idea is to work ourselves out of a job, because if we can prevent now, we don't need to intervene later, right? That is the long-term goal. Again, easy to say, hard to do. And now with the pandemic, it's a whole nother flavor in terms of it was hard enough to teach reading in the classroom, but now some kids in school, some kids not, teaching reading virtually. It's a whole nother situation that, God willing, with enough vaccinations, we can put behind us in September, I hope. It's become it's added to the challenge for sure.
I want to open it up to other members of the community and our community board. I see some people who know a lot more about education than I do on this on this conversation. So if you know who I'm thinking of, and I'm smiling at you. So if you'd like to jump in with an informed question, I'd be delighted. I'll throw in one while you're thinking of one, which is
we have.
We have. Well, I'll throw this in. But I think we have somebody who's interested. Elizabeth, absolutely. Let me defer to you, Elizabeth. Go ahead.
You keep going, Peter. I knew you were looking at me before. So.
Not exclusively you, but I always like to look at you. So that's a lighthearted comment. I was going to say one of the things that my friend from out west mentioned was their program. It included evening sessions. It includes summer sessions, which you've mentioned, and it also included engaging the family. And I think that's both a huge sort of opportunity and a huge challenge, because obviously the family creates kind of the learning environment at home. So any comments on sort of where we are, what we might aspire to do? And maybe that's an area I have no idea, because I think this is hugely a specialized kind of arena where maybe there could be some elements of community support that would be useful.
Family engagement has been in the job description since the beginning. On the one hand, so much of the work comes down to just what a single coach can do in a building. But we've always tried to make sure that coaches engage with families, work with the local parent coordinator at a school to do newsletters, hold workshops. This is again pre-pandemic. But just again, depending on the school and the workflow and just the general culture, do what she or he can in terms of making sure parents know what reading instruction looks like in the building and how they can enhance it at home. I think that coming into the pandemic, it's super interesting in a way, because with families now involved in remote learning, I think like no time ever before can a family now look behind the curtain and really see how school works, including how reading is taught. They might have gone in on open school night or talked to a teacher after school, but or gone in on a family Friday, but nowhere near like now, where you're seeing instruction on a daily basis. My hope is the cat's out of the bag, and we're not going to, those of you with cats know, well, actually cats like bags, but anyway, the cat's not going back in this bag, I think. And my hope is that families continue this interest or continue to want to know about how good instruction should go, including, of course, reading instruction. And that will do more and more for families as we get back into buildings. We're still doing work, though. The coaches, not so much this year because they're teaching and they've got full loads. So they're doing a bit of their coaching work, including family engagement here or there. But in the spring, when remote learning started, they were doing workshops all over the place virtually, which in a way were easier to do. Parents didn't have to deal with childcare, figure out how am I going to deal with dinner, make it to this workshop, get to school, what have you. The biggest problem was I have to remember to unmute myself when I want to ask a question. So I think my hope is there are pieces we've learned through the pandemic, like that virtual PL for families and for teachers too, frankly, that we actually can use to our advantage later on. And one thing we were doing, again, pre-pandemic, although continuing into the spring, was one-to-one tutoring by the coaches. So getting back to that reading specialist thought a bit, we always had the coaches tutoring one student a semester. They used the reading rescue protocol, an intervention protocol that Esther brought into the city years ago, developed by Dr. Nora Hoover, who at the time back when was associated with the University of Florida, if I'm remembering correctly. When I taught in District 7 in the South Bronx, we had reading rescue in my school. I was a program coordinator at one point, so I knew of it. And we wanted to make sure that the coaches had this clinical piece as a part of their professional learning, because you don't learn as much as you possibly can about how a reader strives to read on grade level until you've worked, again, I hope this comes out making sense, until you've worked with that student. That student who's struggling teaches you so much that you can then transfer to your work with teachers in the case of our coaches. So we wanted that as a part of their work. And it also takes care of that teacher fix. These were teachers becoming coaches, not working with kids directly anymore. And for the teachers in the room, that's very hard to do, to not work with children anymore. So they got their kid fix, and they were able to improve their or enhance their training. We were able to up that work, if you will, in the spring by having that tutoring become virtual with the help of Reading Rescue. And again, depending on the coach's situation now and their teaching load, that's continuing. We've worked with Reading Rescue to try and get them into more schools, having nothing really to do with the coaches, but under the universal literacy banner, if you will, so that more coaches can benefit from that intervention support. And something else very exciting, hot off the press, we're working with Brooklyn College. And their pre-service teachers who need observation hours, these pre-service teachers have learned reading rescue and are working off their observation hours by tutoring, virtually tutoring, first and second grade students in districts 16 and 23. So Bed-Stuy and Brownsville. And we've also connected with some outside philanthropy so that when the observation hours are done, these same student teachers can continue their tutoring work for a stipend. And the CUNY students were very excited about that. So again, not specific to the coaches, but something under the general banner designed to get at our goal to make sure that kids are reading at grade level. And that's what I was referring to for the summer. We hope to get more students, more CUNY students involved, not just Brooklyn College, but the university dean for all of the schools of education is quite interested in this idea. So we hope to involve more schools in the spring, more CUNY schools, but who knows, maybe some of the private schools in the city. I think it also does something, and now I'm on a tear, so feel free to stop me, but it does something for those student teachers in terms of training for their first teaching job. They are going to be so much more marketable, and we'll want to hire, we should want to hire those folks so much more quickly because they've got direct experience teaching children to read, which we don't see a whole lot when we hire new teachers, unfortunately.
That was great. I'm going to invite Elizabeth to ask a question because I'm a teacher and I always like interested student to ask a question. I have a few more to think of, but Elizabeth, do you have anything top of mind?
Well, first of all, I love just having the opportunity to say hello to Andrew and to Esther. It's great to see you.
You too.
And a quick sort of pre-question to my other questions. Reading rescue, is that the same as or different from reading recovery?
Different.
Okay. So that's useful.
Yes.
We in Community Board 8 clearly do not have the same issues in terms of reading as many of the districts, community education districts and community board districts in the city. And to some extent, that is because we serve a largely more privileged population economically and socioeconomically. However, there are those who would say that in the history of District 2, what really made District 2 leap forward and leap out from other districts in the city was not the demographics, but that it was a district-wide implementation of reading recovery. Sort of, in the 20 years ago kind of time frame. And so it makes me kind of wonder in this big picture process, what has worked before and what has happened to it relative to this program. As good as our Community District 8 schools are, we still do have a couple that are 20 percentage points below the others on reading ELA results, and sort of how do we help families in our community who may be zoned for those schools as opposed to the schools where the test scores are in the upper 80s and low 90s. How do we help our families in those school district zones? And then just tying back to your example of the Brooklyn College program, I had written down a note. How do we use all of what we're learning now to go upstream to teacher training? What is clear from this is that teaching is a profession like law or accounting. It requires a long apprenticeship, a long learning period until you get to be, truly standalone. And I think this is very much at odds as a concept and a construct with what many teachers believe is their classroom, they're, independent, and that is in many ways a position that is supported and reinforced by the union contract. So how do you deal with that?
Yes.
What a nice
And
question to address.
I'm sorry, say that again, Peter.
I said, I went into my flip mode. I said, what a nice, easy question to address.
Right.
There you go.
If I only had problems like that, I mean, I
There you
will
go.
make one quick comment, which was, I was a management consultant for, 20, 30 years. And I discovered in a matter of weeks, I could be helping. I did a bunch of work with Citibank businesses and I could add value. And I mean, I just underscore what Elizabeth was saying, which is when I started teaching, I discovered how much more I had to learn. So go ahead.
I'll start at the end because I can't remember. It might have been Rami's question that made me think about the coaches as members of the UFT and just their interaction with teachers alone. So it's again a school by school situation, but teachers have to want to be coached. We can't force anyone into this supportive relationship, and sometimes it's very much a teacher who could benefit from that coaching who wants nothing to do with it. That's problematic. We can work with school building leadership to try and convince otherwise, but we don't want to be seen as evaluative. Our work is not in that vein. We're only supportive. We've had better luck, just as an aside, of focusing first on teachers who want to work with us and showing other teachers the value as a result. Maybe a better evaluation, even though that's not our core job for you to do better on the Danielson rubric. But if it's a side benefit, it may get you in the door of a more resistant person. The coaches being members of the same union sometimes helps us, sometimes it doesn't, in terms of trying to work with those teachers who could benefit from this additional support. It's not easy though. I think the pandemic has shown us what the U of T is willing to do, not willing to do. Some teachers go by that, are loose cannons, if you will, sometimes, and will do what they think is right for students or more right. I can't, other than give my own opinion, I'd say on where I think the U of T goes awry in that respect. It's a tough thing though. We can't do exactly what we'd like to do as easily as we might because we're navigating these relationships with labor partners. But not just the U of T, with CSA as well. Our coaches, I wanted to say this too, this came up or was a thought in a prior question. Our coaches work for me. They don't work for their principals that they are assigned to. They're assigned to those schools, but they don't report to the principal. And it's quite a distinction. They have to figure out a way to work with that principal and that community collaboratively, but that principal can't have them do something that would go against what we're trying to do. Give them a coverage, for example, instead of coaching a particular teacher. I think I'm trying to address all the pieces of your question, Elizabeth. I think in terms of reading recovery, I wouldn't mind Esther giving us some history of that. That does go before my time at Central. I can talk about reading rescue being similar in that Nora Hoover saw reading recovery, wanted to enhance it, bring more foundational skill work into it, make something less expensive and more accessible to schools. In terms of reading recovery's work in District 2, yes, that's where I would need help with the history. And maybe I could add to that, Esther.
Sure. So there is a similarity between the two programs because Nora Hoover did base the initial reading rescue work on Mary Clay's work. She was the developer of reading recovery. The big difference is in money. Well, let me step back for a minute. They're both programs for grade 1, primarily, 5 days a week, half an hour a day, 1-to-1 by a trained professional of some kind. Reading recovery, to train that professional, you have to spend about $200,000 for the training year. And then after that, obviously, you have to give them time to do that 1-to-1 training. Reading recovery, the way that Nora Hoover saw it, should not take a whole year of training. It should take about, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks of training, and then a little bit of on-site support. And it is very heavily researched, primarily other people as well, but 2 big studies that were published by Linnea Erie. She's emerita at CUNY Grad Center. And it showed that it didn't matter if it was a teacher or a paraprofessional. It didn't even matter if that para had a very heavy accent. I mean, that was part of what they looked at. So it's much more economical. It targets the same kids. And what's very important to the research community is that Reading Rescue is an evolving program. So it doesn't change every day, but there are opportunities to insert, which has been done, more of a multisensory approach to the brief phonics segment. It continues to evolve, whereas Reading Recovery, that founder is dead, sadly. And more important, no one is touching anything that she did. So whatever new research has come out since then, it's a very static program. District 2 loves Reading Recovery. There are some schools that use Reading Rescue as well. There are about 90 schools in the city, I believe, that use Reading Rescue. I don't know what the current numbers are, maybe a bit more. And Lucy Calkins brought it into her schools as well. And that was subsidized by there is a foundation for Reading Rescue that subsidizes some of the cost. So when I was a principal in District 2, just about that 20-year point, Elizabeth, that you're talking about, I had 8 Reading Recovery teachers. But when I moved up to be director of literacy in a high poverty school district in the Heights, there was no way that the schools had money for that. But Reading Rescue caught on because it had a similar cachet. And for me, it had better street credentials in the research. So hopefully that gives a picture. There are going to be similarities, when you look into a room and somebody is doing one or the other, it's going to look the same because of that 1-to-1 tutoring structure. And they both are very, very specific as to what you do in the half hour, but they are quite different, as Andrew said.
I'm going to jump in briefly and say, I don't know if this is realistic, but I very much find this topic interesting. And I don't know whether any of the assessments or reviews or, that you just mentioned, Esther, are something that one can access, as a layperson, but I would be enormously interested if that were possible.
I would be happy to, I'll make sure that I get your email and I'm happy to send them to you.
I'll give you a hint. It's Peter Patch at AOL.
Okay. Right.
I can remember that.
Peter Patch, AOL.
I'm open to other comments. I mean, I could come up with a few myself. I'm not sure who's still listening. I do see this as at least philosophically, part of for the community board, our what we're calling our social justice, social equity set of interests. And again, I think you two can speak to this knowledgeably, and I'd be interested in your comments actually. But as a layperson, I feel this is the kind of thing one would want to put their heart and soul into for our community members. And again, I think of the community, no child left behind does not mean just a child next door. It means no child. And therefore, to me, certainly it includes, all the schools in Manhattan, beyond our district, all the boroughs. And, after we solve that one in the next few years, we can go on to other cities.
I'm going to retire after that one.
Yeah, right. I will mention, thank you.
Just letting you know.
Andrew, you mentioned that Philadelphia has a citywide program called Reading by Fourth, and I looked at that again just to get a feel, for what's involved, and I think that is, if I recall, that is intended to be sort of citywide. Well, you could put a lot of Philadelphias in the school system we're talking about here, but I really admire the ambition of that.
Elizabeth has her hand up, and then Alita has our board chair has also just raised her hand.
So
Right.
you guys absolutely addressed sort of the big picture questions that I threw out there. I guess I'd love to bring it back home a little bit to Community District 8, and well, call it the Community Board 8 area. How do we support our families and support the schools that may not be at the same level as the other schools? What are the questions that we should be asking of our principals? What questions should we suggest parents ask so that they can understand where the differences may be and help push for change and improvement in their own schools?
I think it's powerful when parents ask, family members ask, what programs are in use? How is my child being taught to read and write? And push, because sometimes teachers won't give, not that they're obscuring, but I think they might err on the side of not giving enough information or not being specific enough. So parents pushing at what programs, how's that instruction going? How do you know? How are my children, or how is my child being assessed? And even nitty gritty, if my child isn't making the progress I think she or he should, what can I do? How are children coached in the classroom in terms of their reading? You see this on Twitter a lot, put forth by those of us in the science of reading group, if you will. Does a teacher reinforce or coach a child to read a word by looking at the picture? That's a prime example. And actually, and that's been a huge prompt use of bad instruction.
Bad instruction, yes.
Bad instruction. And the idea where it might feel like it makes sense. And it's been a huge prompt in use by Teachers College, Reading and Writing Project, by the staff developers. And the issue there is, it's not that we don't want children to enjoy the illustrations in a picture book. We do. The illustrations add to the meaning of the text. They help in terms of comprehension. But the picture directs the child away from the print. And the print is exactly what we want the child to attack. We want them to look closely at those letters. Think about what sounds those letters represent. How do I blend those sounds together? What word is that as a result? Is that word a word I know? Do I have that in or as a part of my oral vocabulary? And if I do, then meaning is going to be brought to mind. I know that word, and I'm going to remember that word, and most likely, not necessarily, but most likely read it the next time I encounter it. And and again, it seems like such a simple thing. It really isn't. But by emphasizing that picture, we're really reinforcing a bad habit, how a reader who
Right.
is struggling tries to figure out that word. So really little
And
things
the
like
challenge
that.
here is that parents don't know this.
Yes.
You know, so parents will ask those questions, get the answer about looking at the picture, and the parents may think, oh, that makes sense,
Yes.
and think that that's good instruction.
Right. And it's an issue we see, and I don't want to pick on Lucy and the project necessarily, maybe a little bit, but it's an issue we see certainly in that program and in many others. Something else we see really in that same vein is, and this can be controversial, but the whole idea, well, I'm not presenting it well, but the idea of leveled books and just leveling in general, that's been a part of city DNA since Mayor Bloomberg and Chancellor Klein, and the project being used across the regions at the time. And even though it's 15 or so years later, for some schools, it's as if no time has passed, and all of that thinking is still present, even though we come back with, well, the research says this, and that's not really a good practice. You might want to consider changing that. Leaders are stuck, teachers are stuck rather on practices that are not as worthwhile, not as promising to use as they could be. So I think it's education of parents, which is not easy, right? Letting them know it's not something you just pick up. I think we're seeing lots of good information. Again, not to call out Twitter, but it is a place where you see a lot of information that's been put out there. National Center for, oh goodness, NCII, Improving Literacy. They've put out a slew of family-facing materials that are really friendly along this line. That would be a place to look. Haskins Lab out of or associated with YEL. They've got a great site of not just information for families, but for teachers, printed material, videos. And again, I think so much of what's happening now, pandemic-wise, just getting families used to having to deal with being online more if they weren't necessarily before, finding information out. This has all been a boon for that. And that's why we've got to do just more and more work with families. And we're really pleased that we're making, again, every school, every district a bit different, but making lots of headway with many districts, more than we have in the past, because they want their families to have this information. They want their families to be fuller partners.
I'm going to make one quick comment that I'm going to ask Alita, I think, had a question, which is this notion, and I'm always looking for sort of the possibility, but you know, if there's a way to actually use, one of the benefits of COVID is that we're now sort of more accustomed to video, and we can capture a broader audience, although it has its limitations. And the notion of engaging parents and thinking of addressing the question you're just speaking to, you know, begin to think about what it means to learn. And I suspect there's also a potential concern of those who you know spend, you know, a relatively short period, you know, minutes to hours learning, suddenly think that they're a little bit of an expert and start coming back and suggesting that someone else, you know, needs a little coaching. I pause. You get my point. Alita, do you have a comment or question?
I do. Thank you, Peter. And first of all, Andrew, thank you, Peter. First of all, Andrew, thank you so much for being here. It's really invaluable to hear about this, and reading is so essential, not just to read, but to be able to do. math problems. I'm actually tutoring a little kid in math, and that's not the issue is reading, but reading is essential for all of that. So I'm wondering a couple of things. One is that, oh, and in full disclosure, my mother was an elementary school teacher in the Bronx for decades. So
Oh, very good.
yeah, so education is a big thing. I used to help her grade, don't tell anyone, but help her grade papers. I loved it when I was in junior high and high school. But in any event, last spring, not this past spring, but the previous spring, I think Scott Stringer held a press conference about keeping teachers in the system, teaching for longer with mentoring opportunities or internships. And if I missed you addressing that, I apologize. I was a little distracted for part of it. So I wanted to ask you about that and if that's gotten any traction. And then the other thing is I've read a little bit about learning to read or reading just when I come across it. And one of the things that I had read was that so much of reading comes from family life, and that for kids, it's not enough to really learn to read. You have to want to be able, you want to read and to continue to read. And so and this is what I learned when I had my kids, is that I was advised by friends, it doesn't matter what you read as a parent, if it's a magazine or a newspaper or advertising in a cereal box, it's that you're reading and kids see you doing that. So is that something that the schools work on with families, and do they help? My kid went to a public school and there were always book drives, and she loved being able to go and pick out books. Is that something that the schools do? And is that something that CB8 could work on, is trying to, and I don't know if we're allowed to, but just trying to do some kind of book drives with books to be distributed among the schools in our district?
I'll start there and then go back to mentoring. I think, well, I'll say I'm all for a love of reading. The problem with it is that children have to learn how to read, because if I know how to do something, chances are I'll love it, or I'll like it at least, or I'm able to do it, and that like and love will develop. I think that the issue sometimes with the love of reading argument, if you will, is that if I just plop a child in a room of books, she or he will be able to read. And for children who are striving, they may have some sort of language-based disability, or be somewhere on the continuum known as dyslexia. It's not anywhere near rather as easy as that. So it could be a bit chicken and egg. I need access to books in order to have that material for practice. It's sometimes where we go down the culturally relevant and sustaining road, that children need to see themselves in stories in order for them to develop or continue on. What am I trying to say? In order to have that love of reading, to have it enhanced. But I want to make sure kids can first read at all, because you can't access those books if you can't read. Yes, you could look at the pictures, but really read. So all that to say, books are important. It doesn't make up for actual reading instruction that we know needs to take place. And I think lots of I can't speak to community boards, but most schools welcome, again, forgetting about the pandemic for the moment, I would imagine most schools would welcome book drives of one kind or another. You can never have enough books.
That's what my apartment looks like.
Let me
Yes,
just check in if
exactly.
there are other members of the community and our community board who'd like to.
Can I go back
please.
to the mentor? I just wanted to answer the mentoring piece. I think one thing interesting we've seen with the coach role is it's part of a career pathway for teachers. There aren't a lot of places for a teacher to go if a teacher wants to go somewhere that isn't administration. So this coaching role provided an additional path for folks in the system. And God bless, because they don't make any more money than a teacher who's got the same number of years of service, same educational background. There's no stipend like there is for some DOE positions that are similar. They actually work more hours per day and 5 more days per year than a school-based teacher. So it really goes to their dedication to the role. And another interesting piece, well, two things I'll say. One, we've seen at this point, as we are getting to the holidays of year 5, upwards of around 30 of our folks, 30 of our coaches who've been promoted, assistant principal, education administrator, various roles in the system. We actually just got our first principal this year. So a coach who had become an AP, then went on to a district role, maybe the district role first before the AP, but then a principal. And while I was sorry to lose each person, I have to think about it as I'm building capacity for the system. And what a delight it'll be, just what a boon to the system to have those leaders have come through the training that we've given and the work that we've done together. And I don't see that stopping. And the other thing I'll say in this vein, and in no order of importance, one thing we're looking at in terms of the evaluation of the initiative and are we doing a good job is, are we retaining teachers? Because if our coaches are doing what we want them to do, teachers should stick around, right? A teacher who feels supported is going to most likely stay in that role in that building. So somehow, and this is up to or on the plate of our research and policy support folks, can we show at schools that have been supported by the initiative greater teacher retention than at comparable schools, for example? So a few different ways of looking at or thinking about your question.
Thank you. Again, I'm sorry if it was duplicative of your
No,
point.
no, no.
Okay.
No, we hadn't talked about that yet.
Oh,
So that was
okay.
great.
Thank you
And
very much.
as a layperson, I want to add my acknowledgement. I think the fact that people move on from this program into assistant principal roles is fabulous. I would consider that a huge win, because you're obviously creating the values and the culture within the broader system, demanding what you're trying to make available.
I hope so. We'll see. It's early yet, but
Right?
that's the idea.
To me, it's a given. You can do the finer assessment. I'm open to other people who may want to coming. I actually want to thank you both enormously. Esther, thank you so much, as well as Andrew. And actually, I'll give you a, we'll close up in a few minutes, but if you care to share both, I'm not sure which order, what you like best about what you do and what some of the challenges are that you didn't fully anticipate, because I have to imagine it's both exhilarating and thrilling to do what you do. And I imagine there's been some allusion to, perhaps not every population or every individual is equally receptive to what you're trying to make available. But from both of you, if you care to share.
Esther, do you want to go first?
Well, mine will be short because I retired on January 1, coming up to a year. So now I'm getting both perspectives. But in terms of all my years at the DOE, over 35 years, you see little droplets of what you have put out. And I hate to say, I shouldn't use that analogy in the time of COVID, but you have little things that you kind of put out, and
consider it a healthy virus.
It's
Yes.
the healthy stuff. And sometimes you see it take root. But, and I know you're asking about, what is the positive stuff? I would say the greatest enemy of the Department of Education is scale. I said it while I was inside, and I see that even more outside. So really, I think we have to start thinking in terms of impact in more targeted ways. It doesn't mean that you can't help everybody, but you have to think in terms of the impact in more maybe I'll use the word decentralized way. And
Got
when
it.
it's out there, it feels great. So thanks. Thank you.
Oh,
And
great. Thank you. And thank you for your 35 years. I mean, I, I, I
I'm
shouldn't go here, but I always tell my students things they don't need to learn. And so here we go. But I overdosed on economics, which has a well-deserved title of the dismal science. But I do think, and actually, if I were to start my career over again, I would probably want to do my doctoral work on how you assess the returns from education, which are multifaceted. But again, being an economist, you think about the dollars and cents is probably maybe the least important, but nonetheless, it's hugely impactful. And I don't think there's any area where we get sort of more benefit and payoff from the investment of time, energy, and I'm going to say heart and caring than what you've both done in your career. So thank you for that.
And educators, by the way, never actually retire. They just work in other places after. So, the extra benefit that they get from us. So
That's good too. Andrew?
I'll start by thanking Esther because I wouldn't be in this role if it wasn't for Esther. Esther hired me for this position. And I think I just remember that, again, as an educator, you don't know necessarily the impact you're having. You may never know that child in a class, you reach them in a certain way. You may not ever know. You may know in 10 years when you see that child again, or a family member, they tell you an anecdote and you learn something that you did stuck, for example. So I think there's just the notion of faith in the work, that I have to have faith that we're making a difference. Some days it feels like less of a difference, unfortunately, than others, but that it's going somewhere and it's basic enough that the good work will continue regardless of whether I'm leading it, there's a different mayor, a different chancellor. Our babies need to learn to read. It doesn't matter who's in charge, and we can do a better job doing it. And that's.
I thank you for that. I'm going to pick up on one comment that you made, Esther, which is you mentioned this issue of scale, and when you're in the commercial arena, scale is a hugely important subject. But what I got from your comment is, and what I'm about to say is probably not properly accurate, but it's my shorthand for the moment, which is, in education, it's not about trying to scale something. It's trying to sort of get the attention, capture the attention of one student. Maybe they're more than one at a time, but individual students. And when they feel gotten and understood and appreciated and you're in communication with them, you've got a huge win that can last a lifetime. So thank you for both. Now all my education, my economics education, I'm going to throw out the window. But I want you to know, I have an active fantasy life, and part of it is that I'm going to go to Brooklyn College next year and start in their School of Education. So any other parting shots? I'm going to say thank you both. You've been an immense contribution. I want to stay in touch, actually, with both of you if I can. But Andrew, I have your email. You're on the hook. And Esther, if you care to send those references, I'd really appreciate it. Thank you all.
I'm not sure if there's time, but there are two hands still raised, actually.
Please go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't know.
We have Billy and Marco. We'll go to Billy first.
Great. Thank you, Max.
Sure.
Well, Marco has not asked the question yet, so I'm going to defer to him. And if you'd prefer I email my questions, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I can ask after Marco.
Sure.
Oh, ask the question. They can give a shorthand answer, but if there's more to say, we can. Marco, are you with us?
Yes, thank you.
There you are. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the courtesy that we it's very fascinating to listen to educators. I'm very happy. Meeting.
I'm having trouble hearing you, Marco.
Can you hear me now or no?
Yes. Yeah, now I can.
Why I'm in this meeting? Because of affordable housing. Affordable housing, many people, they think, throw it the physical condition and it's done. No, it's not. This is wrong. This is a physical contribution to some community. The problem of affordable housing is if you give to those families, and those families usually are less educated, less opportunity to work. So the issue is those children will become part of the demand of affordable housing. And since our goal is to reduce affordable housing, we have to stop the reduction of the demand of affordable housing. And how are you going to start reducing that? Teach the children at early age to have the same opportunity that the other children have, the more wealthy children. And in that direction, I don't want to comment nothing against Elizabeth. I have tremendous respect for her. But she said, quantitative, we are okay in our community. I agree with that part because we have less minority. But qualitative, this is part of we can create, and indeed, I create a prototype of affordable housing in which include education. Education is the main issue in that part for the reason that I already expressed. So creating a prototype, and that is for physical creation of affordable housing, we can create this same prototype for the rest of the city. So now, in that direction, one of the question is, they said the educators do not have enough money to do that. I mean, that called me my attention tremendously. So we need to put money over there. Why? Because according with Mr. Cuomo, he said, a poor child or a public school child, the only that they receive is $6,000 per child. Well, the wealthy child in a very well-educated school, they have 36,000. So this is a big disparity. Now is coming the issue of these protesters that we just have. They go and they complain. Now they are in the second stage. Oh, we need to have a plate. We need to have something like that. No, we don't need that. What we need to have is to fight for more money for teachers, for more money for these children that have disadvantage. That is what we need. I believe in something the Americans said. Don't give the fish, teach them to fish. And the only thing that they will learn is just only with education. This is the bottom. This is the good beginning of everything, even though that doesn't guarantee that they're gonna perform very well. For instance, I'm very sad sometimes to listen to some fellow community members that even though they have the whole documentation to make comments, they say, oh, I need more documentation. Probably they read better than me, I'm 100% sure, but they're still asking them for more knowledge. So my point is, we cannot have a paternalist society. We cannot start giving money. We have to give education. And that is where I'm right here tonight. Tonight we have to fight, but I'm gonna take your words, Peter. No child left behind. This is the key of all of that. But this key is not for the wealthy child, because I'm seeing in my community that usually all the wealthy are very well educated. So the first education they have is at home. So the teacher make easier for them, for those children to teach anything. But for those children that have not the same opportunities, not the same family with good education, they don't have these opportunities. So we have to fight. If these protesters need me to go and fight and be in the street requesting for more money, I'm going to be there. But to be right there for a plate or a statue in one park, no, I'm not going to be there, because it's just only to say I was right there. What happened with our community? We need to create. I'm fighting for our community. It's not mine. It's our community to create some prototype that will be an example for other communities that have more problem than us. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Let me just check quickly. Diane, I see you visibly now. Do you want to ask a question? Yes, I'm asking you, Diane. Malika? Question? No?
Unmute. Let me unmute my mic. Can you hear me?
Yes.
No. I'm just moving. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't be moving around. I should be still
No,
and
it's
like looking into the Zoom, but I be doing different things, multitasking.
all good. All good. All good.
I hope it's not so much of a distraction.
No, terrific. I'm pleased to have you here. I've seen you've come before. Thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Billy, you can ask your question as a short answer, but then I think we have to let Esther and Andrew go and have maybe dinner. Billy?
Sorry, just was getting unmuted. I'll try to keep it brief, and if there's possible to take this on offline, I'd be grateful. Two quick ones. Well, they're not that quick, sorry, but one was about education funding. We've talked about the reading recovery program. We've talked about reading coaches and the funding issues. Sounds like the schools are out of their own budgets, deciding whether to, embrace these programs. And my question on funding was, would it make more sense in terms of executing this for DOE to essentially have a pot of money to hire these teachers and to place them at the most at need schools, rather than what I think I'm hearing, which is that schools are making the decision themselves whether that take part in reading coaches? My other question was, there was a criticism from a former Assistant Secretary of Education at the federal level, not necessarily just dismissing the success of reading coaches, but she said that it would be better if we had district-wide shared curricula for reading, rather than what I understand we do in New York City, which is we do have a sort of a curriculum schools can take from, but schools get to decide what their curriculum is. And I'm wondering, do you think this would be more successful, reading coaches, in our goal of 100% literacy, if we had a shared curricula in each district, or perhaps even citywide, as opposed to giving schools that level of flexibility?
Thanks for those questions. Actually, that first question will clarify, because I didn't want to lead you all down the garden path there. So reading coaches are funded centrally. So a school, Carmen used to talk about it as a gift. Schools do not pay for reading coaches. It is a central budget. Even this year, even when coaches are acting as teachers, I'm still paying. So teachers, or the coaches rather, don't cost schools a cent. And that was purposeful, so that control is kept to a degree at Central. And we are not asking schools to fund a mandate in that way. If a school does want to pursue reading recovery or reading rescue, most times that does come out of their local budget. Sometimes reading rescue comes to a school via a grant, so it may also not cost them anything. I don't know of any grants at the moment that fund reading recovery, but it could work, or it's not that a grant couldn't. In terms of that shared curriculum, yes, I would be all for so that would be a tough choice if I had to say one or the other. I'd like to have both if I could, please. But I think I don't think in New York City it could ever be one program. I think if we could get a menu of curricula that, in terms of early literacy, are comprehensive and structured and aligned with the science, and schools could pick and choose, and our coaches could help teachers in terms of learning those programs, knowing them better, that would be the ideal. And there would always be, I feel like there's always talk of a waiver, meaning if a school is successful with something it's using, it's not one of the menu programs, but they have actual evidence that most children, subgroups included, are achieving, then great, you continue to use that. But something shared would go a long way. Sometimes we see, even at a single school, kindergartens using one program, first grades using something else. So the first struggle is just one program, K5, or even K2, 3, 5. But that would be an ideal, along with a common assessment. So we would have a real gauge, kindergarten to second grade across the city, for where kids are and how we can better apply that support or have that as an additional metric. We used to have something like that, but we haven't in a long time. So if someone asks me, how are K-2 doing across the city? I can't answer that question because we just don't know. We just don't know.
I want to, you're very welcome. Thank you all for your questions and for being engaged and attentive. And thank you both for being, stellar, inspiring, and just making tremendous contribution for which I am, and I think we all are eternally grateful. So thank you. And we shall say good night.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Be in touch, Andrew.
That sounds great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks all. And thank you, Max.